Afternoon, gentlemen. Hope you're having a great start to your Friday so far. As we get started on the final chapter that we'll cover, and with this being with this being the final chapter, it represents a great opportunity for you all. If you're a little bit behind on the reading, to get caught up. The final exam in here will be the final week of April. Exact dates I think will probably be announced sometime next week. Those are set by the university. Um, but this final chapter, relatively short. I'll spread it out because we got a couple weeks left, and uh, like I said, I'm afraid if I let y'all go completely, that some of y'all might disappear. So we'll spread it out a bit. Some of the sessions will be a little bit shorter than others, and we will not meet any Fridays for the rest of the semester. So we will not meet on any Fridays the rest of the semester. Those could be days where, particularly, and we will have some time for some reviewing here. So one of the things that I want you to start to do is look through some of your old notes, look through some of the old lectures. And if there's any things that you have questions about or want to go over in a little bit more detail, we can spend probably the tail end of next week doing that. But don't ask me like, hey, what does this mean type question. So really dig into those things. And if it's something that, I can expand upon your understanding on once you've done the legwork and trying to get the understanding for yourself, then we can have some of those discussions as well. When we talk about the suburbanization of America, again, keep in mind, as we've talked about with everything, how these concepts and ideas tie to each other. So we talked about before the Industrial Revolution brought several people into these urban centers, particularly in the North. They came from, Europe, places like Italy and Ireland, Poland. You had a lot of people come through the Great Migration that happened after the Civil War, beginning in roughly 1910, extending all the way really through the 1960s. Where you had Black people coming from Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, and coming to the North, where again, there were so many factory jobs. We talked earlier about, the urban planners, how they had to design the cities in such a way to account for all those people. We discussed how cities almost became like, marketing their cities as tourist attractions, and they designed buildings, bridges that kind of stood in as symbolic images of those cities. We discussed in great detail the role of sports teams, and again, and listen here, like it's this is the part where unfortunately, like a lot of times we think that the only thing to be written down is what's on the screen. This is the part when you go back and look at the lecture over the weekend. These are the kind of things that you want to be writing down, because what I'm doing now in this short time is kind of giving you a brief review of everything from the class and connecting these dots in a way that I expect you all to be able to do intellectually, particularly on short answer and essay questions on the exam. Again, just memorizing this information is, I think that, most of you all have seen by now, like that's, again, I can literally get somebody in 4th grade to do that. For college level critical thinking, we're trying to do a little bit more. So when we're talking about suburbanization, the focus of this chapter is really important that you understand intellectually how that connects to everything else that came before. So we talked last time about how sports teams, you have all these different people coming. South Carolina, Mississippi, Greece, Italy, Spain, Britain, Germany, Ireland, Poland. You got all these different people. but we need to find some way for these people to find cohesion. So one of the ways that people will unify across cultures was, through teams. And that's one of the ways that they will learn about America and learn about, the new places they were in. So, all these people may be, really disparate and have these different cultures, but they can all unify behind like the Brooklyn Dodgers, for example. So those are really important aspects of cities. And even to the point in the modern day where they define cities so much to where teams can leverage that attachment by, hey, build us a new stadium for, $300 million at taxpayer expense, but we're going to move to Los Angeles. Build us a new stadium, Houston, or we're going to move the Oilers to Tennessee. Better do it or else. And most cities blink. Now, connected to all this, as we talked about, right, with ghettos and enclaves, and the view oftentimes of the city being a less inviting place, many of these cities became more and more congested. You just got so many people all on top of each other. The competition for resources became even, more fierce. So we talked a little bit about this when you all spoke about the urban planning, and many of you all addressed this in your papers of how a government stimulated, this is an important distinction, a government stimulated pathway to try and alleviate some of this congestion was the creation of suburbs. And the suburbs are not just places. They're not just geographical places. They also, present a certain imagery. So people oftentimes, in places like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, what have you, you might be living in a city, and if you move to the suburbs, you feel like you're coming up, if you will. The suburbs are oftentimes viewed as a safer place, more peaceful, better schools. So again, and again, that's not always true. And keep this in mind, right? Because one of the things that's happening today in the 21st century, because you also have to write about gentrification. And what do we mean by gentrification again? Anybody recall that? What do we mean by gentrification?
Is gentrification is when not necessarily the higher class, but people of a higher class, they go into a certain neighborhood and they basically transform that neighborhood into they want to live in.
Excellent, Charles. And then the final part to that, don't forget this, it's not just that the higher class people move in. What happens to the people that used to live in that neighborhood? Y'all cannot forget that part of the definition.
They usually, you go ahead, Charles.
Oh no, you good, Charles. Yeah.
They usually, the people in those neighborhoods usually become homeless or move out because of the cost of living becomes the rise.
Excellent, Deshaun. Excellent. Good. So, right. So it's not just that. So those high end people move in to neighborhoods that used to be the ghetto, Deshaun. Just a few years ago, this is the ghetto. Nobody wanted to come over here. But now you got all these rich folks moving in. It's a hip, cool neighborhood now. And all the poor people, they get priced out because the rent, the taxes go up dramatically. So now, all the cool white people, they want to live in Harlem now. They didn't want to live there for 100 years, was scared to go to Harlem. But now that's the high place to be. So today in the 21st century, Harlem is predominantly white, the capital of Black America for most of the 20th century. So keep this in mind, right? Because again, like the idea was that these kind of images that we're talking about here in the suburbs, you couldn't have that in the city. You can't. So you talk about curving roads and tinted lawns and shuttered windows, elaborate doorways, pride in ownership. Not like the ghetto where people just, they ain't cutting their grass. They just throw their trash anywhere. Are there places like that? Absolutely. There's also a lot of urban environments where Black people take great pride in their communities. Keep this in mind, right? A lot of the places where we live, people are telling us that these places are no good and you got to move out of there to get safe. You know, and I get it. Like every time, like, I come home, people are like, talking about moving out of Deshaun. Hell, my brother like did it one better, Deshaun. This dude actually moved over to Indiana. So Indiana, like, it's right on the border of Chicago. So a lot of people will live in Indiana, but work in Chicago and do all these things in Chicago, but live in Indiana. And again, like some of it is like, in their case and everything, like the property taxes to live in Chicago, like if you own a house, like it's steep, like it's costly. Indiana's a lot cheaper. Hell, like my father would actually cross the border, Charles, to buy gas in his car in Indiana because it's cheaper over there. About a 15, 20-minute drive, like, nothing too crazy. But where
That's
some
about
can
how
go to
it is in
Indiana,
Columbia.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Deshaun.
That's about how it is in Columbia, man. My girlfriend from looking for houses. And if you ever been on the outskirts of Columbia, you'll know Lexington, you got Camden, Elgin. And we was looking in places like that to buy a house with a yard just so we could shoot to Columbia because the houses was so much in Columbia.
Absolutely. That's a great example. Yeah, I was like I considered moving to Columbia, particularly once like I got into a leadership position and everything, and I knew I had to be spending even more hours on campus. And I just looked casually. I didn't look too deeply, but yeah, I found that as well. And it was more likely I wanted to, like my thought was I would want to live in Columbia, but you're right, Deshaun, like it probably would be more cost effective to live on the outskirts. And that's true in many, many cities. So again, like I still encourage you, like, if I would ever move back to Chicago, like I would want to live in the city, but I would also know it would cost. Like I was paying like, way more money for a lot less space living up there than I do down here. Now it would be worth the trade-off for me because of what I would have outside my, doors. And having everything that I wanted to have access to right there. But I can understand, depending upon your lifestyle, particularly for people with children. Like again, I was doing this to Sean when I was single. Doing that, like you got 2 or 3 kids or something, like it can be tough. And God help you if you're trying to like find a good school for them kids to go to in Chicago. You're almost certainly going to have to put them in private school. So it's so the response to that, whether you're talking about Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, New Orleans, more and more people have moved to the suburbs. This is a collective attempt to live a private life. As we talked about in city environments, you got people all on top of you all the time. People all out, every hour of the day. But the suburbs very quickly, Stephen, became segregated by economic class and race. So you would have like, certain, like, again, in a city like New York, of course you have segregation, but you're going to be forced to deal with people that are not like you. In the suburbs, you can kind of just go off into your own world, and you don't have to like, again, like, as we'll talk about probably starting next week, a lot of these spots be like gated communities and stuff like that. So, like I said, people be almost in their own world and they don't even have a clue of what's going on with different classes and different races. This is why, like, when George Zimmerman, like, saw Trayvon Martin walking around, like, it was just like, mind blowing to him. Because again, some of these, areas are just so deeply segregated. Like, it's like, what could these Negroes possibly fucking doing here? They can't possibly live here. So the city produces, the suburbs consume. By production, we mean that most of these people, Deshaun, they still work in the city. So again, like in Chicago and stuff, you have people, coming in on the trains and stuff. And I've done both. Like I've lived in the suburbs, I've lived in city limits. And I've always, I'm not sure I ever had a job that wasn't actually in Chicago after high school. So even if I was living in the suburbs, I would have to come into the city to work. And that's what many people do. Again, here where I live now, Rock Hill, a lot of people that live here actually work in Charlotte. So the city produces, the suburbs is what you used to consume. Like, so the suburbs shop and buy stuff. City is actually producing. And without the major cities, you know, you aren't going to have those spiraling suburbs. Again, you see this in Atlanta and places like that, for example. But in many ways, this results in a loss of sense of community, where again, you're more detached, you're more spaced out. And as we talked about, the suburbs are dependent upon the city for jobs, hospitals, theaters, department stores. A lot of times, again, if you want to, you know, have access to a wide range of shopping, you're going to have to go into Charlotte. You know, there are hospitals here, but, you know, they're going to be better hospitals and more specialized hospitals in Charlotte. Like, so when I had to go see like a lung specialist and stuff and dealing with my asthma, you know, I would have to go into Charlotte to do that. You know, if you have some type of rare infectious disease, you're probably going to have to go into the city to get those kind of things addressed. And there are different types of suburbs.
Mama, I can ask you a quick question.
Of course.
So when we think about gentrification, we think about like people going into old neighborhoods and doing. So say if you stay in the suburbs, which is a nice neighborhood and stuff, but the city and the jobs and stuff was somewhere else. What if they brought the city and the jobs to your neighborhood? Would that still be a sign of gentrification?
Not necessarily. Great question. Like, the gentrification comes from the displacement. That is an excellent question, because there are some places where, and I'll give you an extra credit point for that question, because again, I want critical thinking and engagement, not just rote memorization of information that you're going to forget probably in like 20 minutes. So there are some cities and communities, LaShawn, that are actually doing and trying those kind of things, where it's like, look, we're not saying like, you know, because the notion is that places are, the ghettos are ghettos because they're of the people that live there. But the reality is that what you structure the environment with. So we believe that, you know, and there have been places where, hey, we can bring businesses in here and we ain't got to price everybody out. We don't have to make this into a white community for it to be a good and safe community. Like, so that, like, so in areas of Chicago, for example, right, as a response to this, there are certain neighborhoods and communities where they have to, like for rental properties in particular, like you have to rent out to certain, like at least 20% of your tenants got to be like low income, for example. And then you can't tell people. So like, you know, the last place I was moving into, I was trying to ask about the demographics. And for my part, Deshaun, I was asking because I wanted to be sure that there was a nice amount of Black people living there. But a lot of people will ask those questions to make sure, like, hey, this ain't no Black neighborhood, is it? But the realtors, they can't answer those questions anymore, at least in Chicago. Because that's how the gentrification happens. Like, oh, if this is a Black neighborhood, I don't want to live over here. It's like, look, it's a nice place. Like, do you want the place or not? Don't worry about who live all over here. So there are ways that, you know, urban planners can structure in that way, and there have been some attempts to do that. And in some areas of Chicago, it's working really well. In other areas, it is not. And I speak to that because that's an area that I know of, you know, definitively, but I feel confident it's happening in other areas as well. But good question. So garden cemeteries are a type of suburb that sound exactly what they sound like. That more times than not, like when you have cemeteries and stuff, and like, you know, be your own judge and observer on this, a lot of them are not necessarily in city limits, but on the outskirts. And this is one of the businesses that unfortunately has driven a lot of like the business in that area. It was a precursor to municipal parks that we see like later on, particularly in the 20th century, like, you know, think of like Central Park and things like that, where more and more, like we said, people want to have access to nature. That's been one of the critiques of urban environment. Since you don't have as much, you know, like, you know, trees, water, engagement with animals. So having public park space has been something that's been really stressed in the construction of urban spaces. I'll leave this up for a moment and then I'll dig back in a minute. As always, if any questions or comments come to mind, don't hesitate to let me know. Don't just write down what's on the screen. Please listen to the discussion as well. It will just be a few more minutes. So again, the hope is that cities can be designed in such a way where you can allow some space for demographic interactions. Hispanic people with Asian people, older people with younger people, middle class with lower class. And by having this kind of exposure, you could have more, a wider enculturation into the values that are deemed as proper for the city. It's also believed that this would allow for improved physical and mental health for the city. Again, the physical health natural, where it allows people spaces to walk around in many parks throughout, places in this country that you probably have seen people riding bikes and stuff like that. I know like in Atlanta, they have one where you can cause my crazy cousin has done this a couple of times, where you can literally ride to the border of Alabama from Atlanta. I'm not going to be doing all that myself, but it's a cool option for, again, where you can do something that don't cost a whole bunch of money, because increasingly to enjoy city life, it does cost money. So it's a cost-effective means, but also something that allows people, again, to get in touch with nature. They have tree-lined parkways, and it gives you kind of a sense of rural beauty. And as I said there, it can be difficult to afford to get away sometimes, particularly in our modern life and society. I know, particularly in times like this where people are, so isolated and been trapped inside for so long. These kind of things certainly have got a lot of traction in recent months, and I'm sure will continue to over the summer. And we'll close it here for today. When we talk about prior to the 19th century, the preference was to live as close to the core of a city as possible. And why do you all think that is? Why was the preference before this to live to a city's core?
Was it because of jobs?
Excellent jobs. One extra credit point. Yeah, so that's what the jobs were. The jobs is what brought them up, to these cities in the first place. So yeah, they want to live as close to the jobs as possible. As we talked about, as the transportation got better, as the roadways got better, that kind of reduced the need for people to be as close to these centers. But initially, the suburbs were awful places. Recall we talked about with the concentric zone before, right? The concentric zones where you have the core, you have the working man's houses, you have the elites, and the further you spread out from that core, the more crime you would have generally. That concentric zone theory was formulated in Chicago, and that still, largely holds true today. Not as much in terms of the suburbs, but in terms of like, the outskirts. It's like, the places that are right almost on the border of the city, the suburbs, oftentimes have a lot more crime. Back during this time, and we're talking about the 19th century here, suburbs were again full of prostitutes, thieves, lower class people. In Paris, for example, like the Moulin Rouge that you may have heard about. Like that's like, so again, that's where things would kind of get buck wild. Like I've actually been there before. It kind of shook me up a little bit, and I wasn't sure that like, that was possible coming from Chicago. It's like, God damn, it ain't shit over here, boy. You can get fucked up bad and well, nobody know. So the suburbs originally were a place of an inferior, debased, and licentious habits of life. So again, crime, debauchery. This is very different from the view that we have of the suburbs today. We will no longer meet on Fridays for the rest of the semester in this class. We'll resume this discussion on suburbanization on Monday. As always, the lecture is recorded and will be posted shortly. You gentlemen have a wonderful weekend. Get caught up on any reading that you may be behind on.